Okay, hey, it's the Geekbus here, and I was talking a little while back about my privilege of having been around some geniuses in my day, and part of what I'm interested in talking about in general is the complexity of human thought and feeling, maybe in the opposite order, and it's just not simple. And I think that for me anyway, when I encounter genius, I don't quite know what to make of it. It's a mystery to me how it works. And another thing that I've talked about a little bit is how it is we find facts in today's information age. There is so much out there that it's impossible, I think, to identify a fact reliably much anymore. There's the scientific method, and there's that kind of fact, and even that, of course, as I think we all know, is subject to all sorts of forces that cause some of the findings to deviate from what we ordinarily think of as facts. So it's tough, and one of the ways we do it, we come to platforms like TikTok to learn things nowadays, and also to put things out there for people to learn. But how do you know that what I'm saying or what I'm thinking about is of any value other than intuitively so, or the force of my charm or something like that? But one way is to get to know a person as well as you can in some way or another. And that's part of my reason for doing these things. Like, what's say psychiatrists and psychoanalysts doing playing the banjo? I've had some comments like, well, why do you put those hashtags about psychoanalysis on your banjo playing? Who do you think you are, either as a banjo player or as a psychoanalyst? And I don't know, I'm just trying to get myself out there, and you can figure out who I am, whether you want to listen to me or not. And it includes all kinds of things, such as my interests outside of my professional life. And this is one of them, playing the banjo. And the reason this dovetails with the genius thing is that some of my favorite banjo players really are remarkable, and in their intellect and their musical abilities and intuition and their understanding of music. Believe me, I realize that this has been true in classical music forever, and so it's not as though we turn to bluegrass music when we're looking for integrity and musical genius and the peak of musical theory and creativity. It's not that it's not there, but it's not people's first idea of where to look for it. So don't get me wrong, but when you do find it there, it's remarkable. And on this instrument in particular, this is a 5-string banjo. It's got the 4 strings that your usual Dixieland banjo is known to have. This 5th string here, which stretches from here, the 5th fret, all the way down to the bridge here. It's got a higher tone than the rest, so that's the way this thing works. And these finger picks that I have on the first 2 fingers and the thumb, so that's 3 fingers. That's what they call it, 3-finger style, Earl Scruggs style. So Earl Scruggs figured out how to play this instrument using these fingers. There was lots of 3-finger work before Earl, but he perfected a way of doing it, and that's unique to Earl's playing, or at least it was at the time. And the interesting thing about it is that if you take these 3 fingers and try to get them to play these 5 strings in 4/4 time, you end up trying to get multiples of 3 to divide into multiples of 4, and it just doesn't go easily, and it leaves you, especially if your thumb is trying to generally play the melody, it leaves you striving to get the melody in places where it doesn't naturally fall, and leads you to syncopate. The melody is the thing. And so Earl had an amazing way of doing that. I'll show you in a minute an example of that. So Earl came along and he took the song Home Sweet Home. Be it ever so humble, there's no place like home. The melody is something like... And there's a chorus, So that's the basic melody, but Earl figured out how to syncopate it, sort of like that kind of thing. And that's a very cool thing that turns it into, you could recognize the melody in there, but at the same time, there's this intricate kind of playing that integrates perfectly with these three fingers. Now, another thing is a guy came along in the 60s named Bill Keith, who I got to know, I had the privilege of getting to know later in my life and his, back when I was a medical student. And he figured out how to play, he and others, but he was pivotal in this, and he had a kind of musicality that very few people do, never mind banjo players who are. An old friend of mine used to say, oh, the banjo is more of a machine than a musical instrument. And there's nothing about what I do here to contradict that idea, nor Bill in a way, but Bill figured out how to play the melody without syncopating it. He figured out how to play fiddle lines on the banjo and melodic lines like that. That kind of thing, and all up and down the neck. It was a remarkable contribution to banjo playing and allowed people to stretch out and do a lot of other kind of things. And there were also other banjo players who made remarkable contributions in this type of area. But Bill Keith, again, had a unique musicality. But there was another thing that Bill and Earl did, and this is the sort of thing that I know I wouldn't think of in a million years. I know this. So Earl wanted to figure out how to change the tuning on the fly in the banjo. So what he did was he drilled 2 holes in the headstock up here, and he put these little pegs in between these other pegs so that they would stick out about here, and they would push the string here. If you turned them, they had little cams, and they would push the string and raise it to a pitch, and then if you turned it and released the cam, the pitch would drop back down. So it would give it a kind of pedal steel type of feel. And he did some really cool tunes doing that. But Bill Keith was not satisfied with that alone, and he had an unbelievably inventive mind, not just musically. And he figured out how to create these tuning pegs here. You can see that, and maybe you can see, there's some little screws on them here and here and here, and you set those screws for an upper and lower limit, and there's a set of planetary gears inside the tuners that allow you to tune up and down to specific pitch, and so something like this. That's part of a Earl Scruggs tune. And Scruggs did it using the cams. Keith invented these things, which I think paid the bills for him over the years, probably more so than being a banjo player, unsurprisingly in this world, because people wanted to buy these, and Earl used them as well, and they're just remarkable devices. I've had these since before I met Bill, so I got them, I guess, sometime in the late 70s, maybe mid 70s, somewhere in there. They still work. They froze up at one point, and I had to do something with them, which was to throw them in an ultrasonic cleaner. I had an ultrasonic cleaner, so I threw them in there in this liquid and let it run for about a half an hour, hoping it wouldn't take the gold plating off, which it did not. I took the screws out, but you can't. There's only so far you can disassemble them without ruining them. So I did that, and then I put some compressed air through them to blow out any coagulated grease and stuff like that, and then filled them up with a little lightweight oil, and it brought them back to life. They worked perfectly, which is part of the reason I'm able to do this. But Bill, he figured out how Earl played all this stuff by ear before he had met Earl, and wrote a book, which Earl ended up selling, with all of Earl's classic tunes written out in music and tablature, which Bill had deduced by sitting down and just plain brute force figuring it all out, and with the great musical talent that he had. So not only did he do that, but he invented these things. And so when it came to Home Sweet Home that I played, Bill had his own take on that, and there's a great recording of him from 1963 on a Richard Green album. Aficionados will know who Richard Green is, but nonetheless, I have that record, as we called them, and on it, Bill plays first just beautifully Earl's version. I'm gonna play this for you, I hope, and hopefully you'll hear what I'm talking about. So the first time through, verse and chorus, is Earl's version of it, which is just beautiful. It's just one of the most beautiful things. It's one of the things that really got me started playing the banjo, and one of the first tunes I figured out myself. But I had figured it out pretty closely myself, and so I loved it, and I played it all the time. I still do. So the first time through is pretty much straight Earl's version. The second time through, verse and chorus, is Bill Keith's take on it, and so it's got some cool little notes and some really, you probably have to dissect it as a banjo player to really get into it, but and to really truly appreciate it. But I do, and there's just some amazing musicality. I can't tell you. There's a lot of people who play a lot of very fancy stuff on the banjo, but very few who build a phrase and a solo or an arrangement the way Bill does. Every time you hear something in there that you wouldn't have thought of, and that just calls forth some sort of musical platonic form. You just feel like he's got this from somewhere else. It's not just the kinds of things that naturally fall out of your fingering. They come from him first onto the banjo somehow. So that's the second time through. Then he modulates to the key of D from the key of C, and then he plays the tune using the tuner, which is another thing that lots of people have played Home Sweet Home using the tuners since then, but I'm pretty sure Bill was the first to figure it out this way, because it's the way everybody else now also plays it, pretty much, or less well, as the case may be. But Bill, what he does is when David Greer is taking guitar solo and Richard Green a fiddle solo, Bill gets tuned up to use these down to D tuning and raises this fifth string up a whole step in the background, so he's got plenty of time to do that. I tried to do it in time, sort of. I think I counted the time, so that the timing of the entire tune is not off, but it's not easy to get to the tuner's tuning, so you'll see. I try to do it, and we'll see if it's not timed very well, but I try. But then you get to hear the use of these tuners, and this is all a long way of saying that Bill invented all these things. But there was another thing too. I went to visit him in Woodstock, where he lived, a weekend once. Got to spend the weekend with him, and his genius really, I watched it right in front of me. And one day we're trying to figure out something fun to do, and he says, well, I've got some cool stuff in the basement that you might be interested in. He says, I don't know if you want to, go check anything out, but if you want to, I've got some cool stuff down there. I'm like, are you kidding me? Let's go. And so we went down to the basement, and the first thing that happened was he just so happened to find a pack of Marlboros down there that I believe his wife pretended to not know about. And she pretended to not know that was going to be part of what went on down there when we went down there. And there might or might not have been some other combustibles of some kind also involved in all of that. But then Bill said, do you want to see my collection of vintage ultraviolet medical devices? And he showed me these, these crazy things that he had, ultraviolet, using, high voltage arc coils and things like that to run these things. And there was one of them sort of shaped, a glass tube shaped like a comb, and he ran it over his very balding pate at that point. Says, I use it myself, as you can see. It's got some remarkable results. It's very funny, but he loved that old equipment, was what it really was, and the mechanics of it all. It was really cool. So we did that. Then he said, I can show you how to build something that I made for my tuners, and they're little handles that would allow you to squeeze them together to pull the second and third strings up to work the tuners simultaneously on those strings. Do you want to make a pair of those? I'm like, well, of course. And so we do that. And the first thing I realized is I never would have thought of this in a million years. It never would have even occurred to me that one needed a device like this. Never mind that I might be able to make one, and never mind that I might be able to make it fairly easily. Here they are. You can see them right here, these two metal things, and you know, when the tuners are down like that, you can squeeze them together and cause both tuners to, it's like a pedal steel double stop, and you just squeeze them together. And what we did was we found an old Radio Shack, little Radio Shack like aluminum project box, and there is no such thing anymore. You could get these, but you could get a little piece of sheet metal. They're fairly soft but sturdy. I mean, I've had these since then for more than 40 years. And we cut out these ovals that are the size of this thing, and he just put them in a pair of pliers and just gave them a 90-degree twist, so that half of it was perpendicular to the other half, so that you could put one end on the tuner spindle and you could have the other end, you know, in this position, so you could work it with your fingers. And then he took a drill and just a regular little hand drill and drilled a hole just smaller than the tuning peg spindle there, and whatever you call that thing. And then we took a rubber mallet and just tapped this onto the spindle. The metal was soft enough compared to the metal of the spindle that the grooves that hold this button on here and cause it not to slip, those made little indentations in the hole, so that it's as though the hole just fit right onto those little spiny ridges there. So now the thing wouldn't slip when you moved it. So I never would have thought of any of that. And then we took the button off, slid those on there, put the button back on, and there they are. I wonder if there's anybody else besides Bill himself who had these. I like to think not. You know, maybe he took all the guys down the basement and made these things with him. But I've certainly coveted them and hung on to them and thought about making pairs for my other banjos. But these, I don't use them all that often. But I do use them for Home Sweet Home because he did. And I hadn't even heard this version of Home Sweet Home when I was with Bill that time. But much later I did, and I said, oh, there he's actually using those. I use them for some fun things every now and then, but mostly just novelty endings, which this is too. But he takes those, and at the end of he's in detuning at the end of Home Sweet Home, and he's got these down here, and he hits this harmonic, which is an octave of the. He uses this harmonic, which is the dominant chord in the key of D, and this one is the tonic chord. So he goes. And it's just one of those icing on the cake type of things. And I think for most people back in the day anyway, you would have heard that and said, what in the world, how is it possible to do that? Well, that's how it's possible. So that's a long-winded way of saying Bill had this wide-ranging genius and this aggressively intelligent mind where he was thinking of all these things constantly and came up with all of that for the banjo, and particularly for Home Sweet Home, where, you know, this was in 1963, so it was early on in Bill's career, relatively speaking. He'd played with Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, which was also remarkable because it was a turn in banjo playing. It was a new style of banjo playing that he was an expert in, Earl Scruggs style, and could play that as well or better than just about anybody, which I think brought him to Bill Monroe. And I did hear Bill when I was quite a bit younger. He had a version of Sailor's Hornpipe on a Bill Monroe record. That was the first I heard Bill, and I didn't know what that was all about, but I loved it. I immediately transcribed it, figured out how to play it way back then. Before I really knew anything about any of this, I just was figuring out how to play the banjo myself. Later I realized Bill's contribution. Anyway, what I'm going to try to do is now to actually play this version of Home Sweet Home Home for you, and I will wrap up the video with that. Hopefully you'll get some idea how cool this stuff is that these guys figured out, and maybe why it captured my interest so much. I first heard the banjo being played this way, maybe it was the Beverly Hillbillies. I'd like to say that you know, when I was a kid in the hollers of Kentucky, I had my grandfather taught me how to play the banjo. I wish that were true in the authenticity department of being a banjo player, but you know, I was in the suburbs of San Mateo, California, watching the Beverly Hillbillies on the TV and say, wow, what is that playing that this guy is doing on a banjo? And that was Earl's, and that's what got me playing the thing to begin with. I'm like, what is that? Oh, I don't know what it is, but I got to be able to do that. I've been fascinated by it ever since. I love the sound of the banjo, which is not the easiest thing for many people to do, but I do love it for some reason, and you know, it's grating to many people, but I love it, and so that's the deal, and so that's my interest in the complexity of the banjo and the types of geniuses who play it. Bill Keith being the top of my list of such people, but there are many of them now in different, they're not Bill Keith, but they are brilliant musicians who are doing all kinds of great stuff. Not all of them young either. I mean, there are some people who, I could name them my favorite composers like Alison Brown and Jens Kruger, but then there are these people like Noam Pikelny, and I mean, the list goes on, and every day there's some new, in my view, kid who comes out and is able to play things that, you know, it's never even occurred to me could be played on the instrument. And guys like Ryan Kavanaugh, and they're all over the place. I hesitate to name any because there's so many that I don't name, but some of them just do some beautiful original music. Others, improvisers like nobody's business, and people playing with Molly Tuttle and Billy Strings these days, you know, I mean, they're just like, already they've got the whole thing mastered, and it's just unbelievable. So banjo has come a long ways, but the minds like Bill Keith's are a part of what's made it happen at all, and this has fascinated me all my life, and the time I spent with Bill trying to grasp how his mind worked was a big part of what I wanted to do. I was watching him think and create, and things pop into his head, and then I was watching the evidence of what he'd already created, and even just trying to figure out what, you know, he made breakfast for us all one day, and took particular pride in exactly how to make a one-egg omelet, which was just one of everything that he approached with a kind of love and creativity and drive for mastery and his own way of doing it, and it just was remarkable. And so hopefully that comes across in this playing too, and it certainly has everything to do with my interest in all these kinds of things. So that's it from the Geek Bus, and here is Home Sweet Home.